Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome our Montanaro home church. Let us prepare our heart to heaven. Let's sing a song. Page 156, The Rainbow Song. 156, The Rainbow Song.
Father, make me a rainbow to bridge old and new. Father, make me a gateway for many to come through. Father, you are the sunlight in a very dark land. Father, make me a prism held in your hand. Father, you are the music, won't you make me alive? I am the kindling, Father, make me a fire. Our voices blend now into one loving song. The dream grows true now, beautiful, strong. Father, make me a rainbow to bridge old and new. Father, make me a gateway for many to come through. Father, you are the sunlight in a very dark land. Father, make me a prism held in your hand. Father, you are the music, won't you make me alive? I am the kindling, Father, make me a fire. Our voices blend now into one loving song. The dream grows true now, beautiful, strong. The dream grows true now, beautiful, strong.
Thank you. Let us stand up and greet Heavenly Father, God, and true parents. Today is September 8th, 2019, Sunday morning. Let us bow. Hello. Join me in prayer. 살아계시는 하나님 아버지, 참부모님, 안녕하십니까? Heavenly Father, God, and two parents, good morning. Here in the New Hampshire, Gorham, New Hampshire, it's raining and little cold, but I feel the weather is changing to autumn season. We have to really physically prepare the clothes and keep warm, and at the same time we want to refresh our mind and welcome this season. Always the time is changing and season is changing. Thinking also the changing. The autumn season we can think more something beautiful and something deep. We wanna see the beautiful scenery and also think of the our future. We are so grateful here in the town. We have a beautiful scenery and a mountain and a nice stream and clean air. We really want to refresh our mind and heart. To the past months was so busy doing activity. Now slowly slow the mind and thinking deeply. We are so happy to meet with you. We are so preparing this time to attend you and receiving guidance to each of us. We can be deeply happy with you, and we can create a better place and a better life. Please guide our pastor, can give us sight, your providence, and also how to prepare our life to make prosper. Please guide this time. We reflect and think deeply and receiving your guidance. Please bless this day and this week. 축복준신 가져온 라망 타미쿠몬토나로 용포고드립니다. I report in the name of Lamang and Tamiku-Montanaro, blessed Central Family, Aju, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Please sit there and welcome our Pastor Montanaro. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Yeah.
Good morning.
In prayer, I was feeling like a lot of my sermons are kind of a lecture or a teaching. You know, I tend to be a teacher. That's my style more than anything. But I think it's important to also realize that worship service is a time to attend God and to recognize God's presence among us and to celebrate God's presence among us. So, although I'm always going to teach, and I think today I'll also be teaching, I want us to take some time to reflect on God and how God is in our life, actually, and to really feel God's presence in our life. So, first I wanted to ask you, what do you think God is like? In other words, what do you think God is dealing with on a daily basis? What is God's life like? What do you think God's life is like? Some people indeed will not believe that God is alive, or that if God is alive, God is like this, cosmic consciousness that permeates everything, that's sort of like a force in the universe. May the force be with you, this kind of thing. And that's a valid discussion to have. But I'm going to assume for the purpose of today's sermon that God is alive, that God is a being, and God is living a life. God has a life. What is God's life like?
Like a movie we saw, the Bruce Almighty. It was playing, he become hearing the all prayer, and he couldn't sleep, and then he was like covering ear and eye, and then,
This is Jim Carrey's movie, Bruce Almighty. God is Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman always turns out to be God somehow, or something like God. He's got that nice, deep, rich voice. But so Morgan Freeman comes to Jim Carrey and gives him all his powers for a week, which Jim Carrey immediately begins to misuse. But one of the things that happens is he starts to hear all these prayers, millions and millions of prayers from around the world, people that are talking to God, asking for things. So that's an interesting point, that God's life is filled with our prayers. And that God is busy a lot of the time trying to, whenever possible, in whatever way that he can, because God doesn't have power to take away our responsibility. We have our own responsibility. If you're asking God, make me rich, do you think God's going to do that? Do you think God's going to answer that prayer? It depends what you want to use the money for. If you want to use the money to save the world, then maybe God will make you rich, or try to. If you try to use the money so you can buy a new yacht, and have a spa and have all your toys and a new jet, I don't think God's going to worry too much about that prayer. So God has to decide how to help people, right? But what else is God's life like? What is God feeling every day? What is our Father? He's right here. What do you think God is feeling? Is it just one thing? Maybe it's complex. It's a complex thing. Last week as I was running one day, I was thinking about God. I was talking to God, actually. I was talking to my Father. And I was thinking, God is desperate. You know, in a certain sense, God is desperate. Maybe many Christians would have a hard time accepting that. Desperate doesn't sound like the adjective we would use for God, does it? God is desperate. Because, you know, we want to believe God is all-knowing, all-powerful, sitting on a throne somewhere, and doesn't have any kind of anxiety. You know, does God have anxiety?
Doesn't seem like he would.
Doesn't seem like he would. But then, when you think, if God is a parent, and we're God's children, and God loves us like a parent loves his children, then we are almost on life support. We're like damaged children, and we're hurting each other too. And there's all kinds of situations in the world where people are desperate. And, you know, for food, people are dying of hunger. There's wars where people are inflicting incredible pain on each other, torture, in Central Africa, Rwanda, and the kind of genocides that are going on. When God looks at this, and in a certain sense, I think God is powerless to help. Because without taking away our free will and responsibility, God has a very limited amount he can do when someone refuses to listen. That's why we need, actually, police, or we need, you know, people who have guns and people who can protect, because there are people who refuse to listen to God. You know, someone's on crack and desperate for their next fix and breaks into your house to steal something so they can sell it to a fence and they can make the money they need for their next fix. That person is not acting responsibly, certainly, and God cannot reach their mind. And so we have to be able to defend ourselves against that kind of person. So, but sometimes we can't, right? And that kind of person does damage to people. People are hurt and murdered and hurt in many ways throughout the world. So when God sees that situation as a parent, I don't think God can be complacent or, you know, like this. When people are suffering, when people are suffering, well, God is desperate. I think there's a desperation in God. So let's take a minute and just reflect on that. That the origin of the universe, our Father, the life our Father, our God is living, is desperate. There's a part of God that's desperate. But is that just God's nature, desperate? Like all the time desperate, like running around with anxiety? There has to be a certain sense of forbearance or long-suffering, because God's been dealing with this for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I asked God this morning, I asked God, how are you feeling? And God said to me, I'm feeling extremely hopeful. Because of Father. Because Father broke things open that had never been broken open before. Racism and religious bigotry and all the things that actually, interestingly, all the things that Father was hit with. Like, Father was attacked in America because Americans were basically racist about Asians. And this Korean guy came over and began teaching Americans, and in 1 week we changed and cut our hair and, you know, shaved our beards and put on a tie and went out witnessing for God, you know. And our parents were saying, I tried for 10 years to make you cut your hair, and you wouldn't do it. And now this chink, you know, this Asian guy, in the 70s, racism was a lot worse in America. Because we just got out of Vietnam, and 10, 20 years before that we got out of Korea, and before that we got out of the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. So I think Americans were a little bit afraid and freaked out by Asians. But they said this Asian dude, you know, I don't want to say the chink, you know, there it is. But that's what people called Father. I heard Father being referred to that by dozens and dozens of times by Americans. So there was racism, there was religious bigotry because he was teaching something new religiously, and Christians and Jews were afraid of what Father was teaching. They maybe still are to some degree, afraid of Father. So he suffered a lot of persecution. He went to jail in America, a land of religious freedom. He went to jail for actually a year. He was in prison in Danbury Federal Penitentiary. And that wasn't the first time he was in jail. He was in jail 6 times, actually, for extended periods and torture. But through all of that, he persevered and he was able to teach. And what are the 2 things we think of when we think of Reverend Moon? What are 2? Let me ask you this. If an American who remembers Father, who thinks about Father, were asked, what are 2 things you think of Reverend Moon? What do you think, Joe, are 2 things that Americans would remember about Father, or that about our movement, or that they would think about?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of concern that it was a cult.
Cult, right. Brainwashing.
Brainwashing.
Brainwashing and a cult.
Right.
And what else? What other thing that splashed the news a lot with Father?
I don't really know.
Okay.
I know that he had a tax problem.
Right? Taxes.
They went after him for taxes.
But what made us famous? What's one of the things that made us famous? You think about Madison Square Garden. Do you remember what happened at Madison Square Garden in 1982?
I don't.
You don't? You know, Mom, right? Well, if I say mass weddings,
mass weddings. Okay.
you would remember that,
What did you
right?
say?
Mass weddings.
Oh.
Okay. Father became famous for exactly those 2 things, brainwashing and mass weddings. This was it. I mean, if you could put it in 2 things, I think. And both of those, actually, interestingly, are the areas that Father led the world. People, have you ever heard the expression, keep your head down, otherwise it gets cut off? In Japan, there's kind of a cultural saying. You don't stick your head up, because if you do, it gets cut off. Meaning, don't try to stand out. Fit in with the crowd. The Japanese are very good at that. I mean, the idea of never sticking your head up. Keep your head down.
But that's when it's be cut off,
No,
when it's down.
no, not what I mean is that there's a crowd of people, and everyone's head is at the same level. But if one person's head is sticking above the crowd, that person stands out, right? That person's head is sticking up. So I think it's very symbolic, especially of the feudal culture. Japanese culture is really a feudal culture, feudalism. Up until the end of World War II, it was a feudal culture. I mean, it had basically the shogun was replaced by the emperor, but there was very clear feudalistic aspects to Japanese society. And even now, the modern corporations like Hitachi and Sony and Toyota and all the corporations are run very much like a feudal empire. The head family, it runs the company and tries to be benevolent to the workers, but the workers are like serfs. They work their whole lives for the company. They live for the company.
On what grounds was he put in prison in this country?
That's a long story. I might talk about that today, but maybe we can talk about that later. But the Japanese culture, when you're a serf, like in Monty Python, The Search for the Holy Grail, right? They walk out with coconuts. The serfs are all terrified of these knights, because these knights are out of their mind. They have swords and armor, and they are killing peasants left and right for no reason. I think that kind of thing happened during feudalism. Basically, the feudal lord wasn't a nice guy. Let's just put it that way. Think about this: if you're a feudal lord, what are the punishments that feudal lords would mete out to the people? Well, I love Nicolas Cage in the movie about the Constitution, about the Declaration of Independence, National Treasure. At the cocktail party at the beginning, he says, let's make a toast to the people who signed the Declaration of Independence. Because if they'd been caught by Britain, they would have been, and Nicolas Cage has that nice style where he gets really intense suddenly.
Yeah.
And he goes, they would have, let me see, they would have been disemboweled, drawn and quartered, hung, and oh my favorite, beheaded. You know, it's like he talks about all the different ways that people were killed, tarred and feathered. You know, these are tortures. These are ways that people were put to death routinely for just offending the feudal lord. You know, they were disemboweled, their guts were cut open, and they were left tied up and left for the birds to eat their guts while they were alive. They were beheaded. They were hung. Right? These are all things we studied, right, in school, in history class. They were hung, they were, they were drawn and quartered. You know, that's a lovely one. You know what that is? Your 4 horses are tied to your 4 limbs, to your legs and your arms, and they're hit to go in 4 different directions. So you're torn, your body is ripped into 4 different pieces. Lovely. This is the kind of ways that, people were tortured. And tarring and feathering, your body is painted with hot tar. Basically, you're naked, and your body's painted with hot tar, and then you're thrown into feathers, so you look like a chicken. And then they tie you up and they run you out of town on a rail. It means that your legs and feet are tied on a beam, and they run you out of town, and they throw you out of town. These are the lovely ways that our ancestors tortured each other. So the Japanese culture was a kind of feudal culture, and when you're a feudal serf, you keep your head down. You don't want to stand out. You don't want the knight to see your head sticking up. And so people hit you in the area that you're standing out. So I have a point in this, believe it or not, that father stood out in those 2 areas. What does that mean, brainwashing or cult? Well, it means that we, in our movement, are intensely supporting an idea. More intensely than anybody else. That our intensity is scaring people. I remember one story. That when we were fundraising, we would be so desperate to make money. Because we felt that we felt God's desperate heart. And we felt we have to save the world. That was actually our heart. People didn't know that. They just thought we were nuts. But we were desperate. I was the first brother in CARP, in our student club, CARP, to break $1,000 in one day. I made $1,000 in one day in 1981, 1982. This is when $1,000 would probably more like $2,000 or $3,000 now. And I basically sold these metal etchings for $5 or $6 each. I was running from store to store to store. And then this was New Year's Eve, I was desperately selling these. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we stopped selling those, and I got a bucket of roses, and I stayed, and I fundraised in different bars and clubs and fast food restaurants for about 5 or 6 hours till they closed. And then I was so close to 1,000, I was in the 900 range. I said, I don't want to sleep, let me break 1,000. So they put me on an off-ramp in LA, on a freeway, and I stood on the off-ramp, running up and down as the cars were waiting for the light, running and selling flowers until I broke 1,000. That kind of intensity we had. And we were tired. We would wake up, we would go to bed sometimes on a fundraising night. We'd go to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock, fundraising in the bars, to make money. And then we'd wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and have morning service and pray and then go out again and do it again. I did this for 3.5 years. This is insane. But what can power you to have that kind of insanity? We were so tired. I remember we were doing a pledge service in the morning. We were doing a prayer service at 5 o'clock in the morning. Takashi Kubota was my team captain. He was such a sweet brother from Japan, really cute. And we were saying our pledge. It's like we said, recite this pledge. And suddenly I heard this smash. He had fallen over. We were all standing up. He just fell asleep standing up, and he fell on his face. He just fell like a board. It was like shoo, boom. he laughed. We all were laughing, but he was like, he was out, you know. This kind of thing. One brother, one sweet lady, when he was fundraising, invited him in. Would you like some tea or something like that? You know, so he went in and sat on the couch. She went to get tea. She came back. He's sleeping. So she didn't know what to do. This fundraiser comes in her house and she's sleeping, so she covered him up with a blanket. And he had a nice long nap. He wakes up like 6 hours later, 5 hours later. Where am I? You know, like this. He goes out. His team captain was looking all over for him. Like, where's this guy? He's gone. You know, finally he comes to the street where he's supposed to be. Like sheepishly, I fell asleep. You know, one other brother was knocking on a door and passed out and fell in the roses by the side of the door. And the lady opens the door and this guy's sleeping in her roses. He didn't even wake up. You know. And this kind of thing, I had experiences like this too, you know. And miracles were happening too. Miracles. You have to know that God was with us when we were this desperate. God was with us. I remember one time I was doing a 3-day fast. I wanted to fast, you know, not eating for 3 days, just water. And I was super intense. I was running everywhere. My captain dropped me off on the corner of, you know, and I heard him say, now I don't think he said this, but I heard him say, go down there and I'll pick you up. And go just as far as you can go, fundraising anything that's open, and I'll pick you up in an hour or an hour and a half. I'd forgotten what it was. So I took off and I'm running. There's almost nothing there. Like there's one place. And I thought, he must have thought about something. And I started running. And I ran about a mile and a half, 2 miles. And I was in great shape then. I was like, you, Josh. You know, I was in great shape. I was just running and running and running. Finally, about a half a mile down, I saw this cluster of shops. They're like a mall, it was like 9:30 at night, 10 o'clock at night. And I went and I fundraised and I made like $60 in like 20 minutes. And then I went to somewhere else. I made like $100. And then I came out and I thought, okay, I'll wait for my captain. But I thought, you know, let me make it easier for him. I'll run back toward where he dropped me off. Thank God I did. He had wanted me to go on a different road. So he was going up and down that road looking for me. Oh. But I started running back and I ran all the way back to the corner that he dropped me off. I said, I was wondering where he was. And he said he was wondering where I was. And I got in the van and I had all this money. And it was like God. You know, I felt God was there. Another time I had a goal of $300 in one day. And I had $20 to go and it was 5 minutes till pickup. So I'm running to go to pickup. I'm still a half a mile away from my pickup spot. And I'm looking, which guy, I'm asking, where can I sell these metal etchings with frames? They're heavy. They had wooden frames with the metal etchings inside. I was carrying this big stack of them. And I'm running with them. And then God said, that house, go. And I ran to this house. I had like 4 minutes. I rang the bell. This guy opens the door. He's almost in a daze. Like he got clobbered on the head by God. Because he says, what are you selling? Oh, good, I'll take that one. Here's $20. It was like, and then he closes the door, and I ran, I was on time for my pickup. This was like, he got hit on the head by God, like clobbered, boom, by this guy's prince. This kind of thing was common. When you're that desperate, God can completely work with you. But what kind of reputation does that earn us? We're nuts. You know, these people are nuts. You know, we were brainwashed. We were brainwashed zombies. We weren't zombies. We were just so tired that we looked like we were zombies. You know, if you see someone who's tired, like, hi, you know, hello, how are you? You know, this is what it was really. So, Father made us crazy for God. The book that you had Mom read was Crazy for God. And the reason that that book was titled that was that ex-member had taken an expression that we used in our movement in the 70s and 80s. We were crazy for God. We wanted to be crazy for God. Because we felt God was desperate. The other thing that Father became famous for was, and let me just say, going back to crazy for God, isn't that great? Wouldn't it be great if everyone was crazy for God? Was like alive and excited and passionate and wanting to save the world for God and do things for God. That kind of passion. Christians were jealous of us. They they said, I don't believe what you're teaching, but I wish I believed it as much as you do. I heard that 1,000 times from Christians who I met. And car salesmen were jealous of us. I would go into car dealerships. I'd be so excited to sell whatever I was selling. I can't tell you how many times I was offered a job as a salesman when I was fundraising. And all of us were. Because we were so excited, so enthusiastic, that the guy said, I can make $1 million with you. You just come, anytime you need a job, here's my card. I got so many cards from sales managers that they wanted me to work for them, So this kind of intensity and passion earned a reputation on the one side of being crazy for God or being a cult or being brainwashed. But actually it was just intensity and passion for God. And that's pretty cool. But Father did that. The second thing Father did was the mass weddings. He broke open all the racism and religious bigotry and ethnic, rivalries and nonsense and national hatreds. He married Japanese with Koreans and they hate each other. I mean, in 1988, at the Seoul Olympic Games, Father had a blessing of 6,500 couples. And every single Korean in that group, there were only 2,500 of Koreans, was blessed to a Japanese person. And if anyone knows the history of Japan and Korea, if you know World War II history, the Japanese occupied Korea for 40 years. They killed the Queen of Korea. They tortured the Koreans. They refused to allow Koreans to speak their own language. They, especially Christians who refused to bow down to the emperor, were sealed in their churches and burned alive. The Japanese occupation was brutal. And they took the young women as comfort women for the Japanese army. They would go into villages and take a 13-year-old girl, 14-year-old girl, and she would be made into a prostitute. And she would have sex 200 times a day with the Japanese soldiers. And some of them survived this experience and went back to Korea, shamed, destroyed and shamed. You can imagine how the Koreans felt about the Japanese. So, Father married 2,500 Koreans with Japanese. The shockwave that shook Korea was like an atomic bomb had gone off. And actually, this is worth reading. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Actually, I know the chapter name, so I can find it in the head table of contents. Basically, a Korean father was torturing his daughter-in-law because his Japanese daughter-in-law, his son, who's Korean, was married to a Japanese girl. And he had so many memories of being hurt by Japan, he couldn't love her. And he was really angry. And page 214. But it's a great book, by the way. As a peace-loving global citizen, Father's autobiography. He wrote it just a few years before he died. I won't read the whole chapter, but it's called 10 Years of Tears Melt a Father-in-Law's Heart.
10 years of what?
10 Years of Tears.
Oh.
Melt a father-in-law's heart. So Father married this woman, and she's just loved her father-in-law. She took care of him, she served him for 10 years, and he had nothing but bad words for her. So, in 1988, a young and well-educated man who had joined our church wanted to get married and sought to be matched. He was matched with a Japanese woman. The father of this is the same blessing, I'm talking about 1988. The father of this young man reacted very negatively to the match. Of all the women in the world, you have to marry a Japanese? He asked. During the Japanese occupation, the father had been one of the Koreans, conscripted into forced labor and taken to a coal mine in Iwate Prefecture in northeastern Japan. He risked his life to escape the mine and walked for well over a month to Shimonoseki, where he was able to board a ship back to Korea. He harbored a tremendous hatred for Japan. On hearing the news of his son's match to a Japanese woman, he threatened to disown him. You're not my son anymore. You betray the family, he said. I will have your name taken out of the family register. No woman from that enemy country will ever set foot in this house. So take her and go away. She is not right for you, so I don't care whether you go or whether you die. This is what the father said. The father was adamant. The young man, however, went ahead and did what he felt was right. He married the Japanese woman and took his bride to his hometown in Nagano, Korea. The father would not even open the front gate for them. Sometime later, he reluctantly accepted their marriage, but his persecution of his daughter-in-law continued. Every time she seemed to have difficulty with something, he would say, "That's nothing compared to what your people did to me. You should have expected this much when you decided to marry into our family." Every time the relatives would gather for a major holiday, the father-in-law would have her sit near him. And he would tell her all the things that were done to him in the Awate coal mine. So he would make his daughter-in-law sit next to him, and he would just tell her all these horrible stories about what Japanese people did to him. Each time the daughter-in-law would respond by saying, "Father, I apologize to you on behalf of Japan. I'm sorry." She would shed tears and ask for his forgiveness. For as long as he would vent his anger at her, she would listen to him, tell the same stories over and over until he was finished, and she would continue to apologize. This went on for about 10 years. It's like, come on, guy, get over it, This went on for about 10 years, and then it stopped. Relatives noticed that his cold attitude toward the daughter-in-law had become much warmer, and that he even seemed to like her. So they asked him, "Why are you behaving so kindly toward your daughter-in-law? She's a Japanese woman. Don't you still hate her?" "I don't hate her anymore," he said. "All the hatred that had accumulated in my heart has gone away. I never really hated her," he added. "I was just venting on her all the hatred that was in me for having been conscripted to work in the mine. Because of her, all the hatred has disappeared. From now on, I'm going to be kind to her because she's my real daughter-in-law." The daughter-in-law had paid for the sins of the Japanese. This is an example of the path of redemption that will lead humankind into a world of peace. So, there are a million stories like that. Father blessed and matched Koreans from enemy parts of Korea, Koreans and Japanese, Asians and Westerns, East and West, black and white, Jewish and Christian, Protestant and Catholic, rich and poor, educated and uneducated. Every possible combination of enemies that he could find, he did. And these people paid the price for thousands of years of history. So the blessing was difficult. The marriage blessing that Father gave was not easy. It was a challenge. I can't tell you how many of my brothers and sisters in the church struggled to love their spouse. But through this process, historical sin was cleansed. Now, Father started this in 1960, when racism was rampant in America. And around the world, I should add. But now, we look on TV, we look everywhere, you see black and white couples, you see Asian and Western couples. It's normal now. In fact, it's kind of popular, right? It's considered to be kind of cool. And nobody minds. I mean, nobody thinks it's wrong. And everyone loves it. But Father started that. Father was the one that broke that ground. So the two things that Father's famous for actually show the two things that Father was great about. Making people passionate for God and breaking down the barriers between people. So when I asked God today, "How do you feel?" God said, "I feel hopeful. Love is flowing everywhere now. It will take time, but love will win. This world will become a world of love." I felt that heart from God. I think God is still desperate. I think God would like to see it faster. God is never patient with sin. He doesn't want to see sin continue. He doesn't want us to continue sinning and hurting each other. But God's heart has changed, I think. Father helped change God's heart, God's experience, God's life. Father did that for God. Can you imagine doing something for God? Most Christians think about what God can do for them, or what God's going to do for the world. But thinking about what you can do for God to change history so that God can be happy. So God's life is free. So God's life is wonderful. So that humanity is happy. Because God can't be happy until humanity is happy. Because we're God's children. So in reflecting today about our Father, who's here in this room with us, those are just a couple of stories. There's so many more. God's heart is very complex and layered, deep. And I don't know that any of us fully understand God's heart. But I think that Father did understand God's heart. A desperate heart to love his children, to save them, to liberate them from sin. Desperately trying to reach out and help them.
Doesn't desperate imply fear?
I guess it can, that's probably why, but there's no better word, is there, for when you, like, if you're a parent and your child is on life support, you're desperate. You are afraid, in a sense. I think God is afraid in a certain sense. I mean, not afraid for himself. Like fear, generally we tend to think of it as afraid for yourself, right? But fear for someone else is, I think, what God's feeling. That's not something to putting God down in any way. That God is afraid for us because we're hurting ourselves. You know, if someone's about to commit suicide, you're afraid. You're desperate to stop it, to somehow to reach them before they do what they're doing. You know, when someone is lost, like if a parent loses a child in a mall, they're terrified, right? They're terrified. If your child goes lost, or a 5-year-old, 3-year-old child goes lost, especially in our society today with, you know, people kidnapping children and doing horrible things to them, you know. A parent losing a child is desperate, is afraid. But it's not afraid for himself. It's afraid for the child. I think God, that's what the difference is, selfish or unselfish. In other words, I think selfish emotions we tend to think of as God cannot feel selfishness. And I think that's true. I think God cannot feel selfishness. Just, you know, screw you all, you know, I'm living for myself, you know, woo, you know, party, you know. God is not that kind of a God. But when God feels desperate or afraid for us, we can understand that's a parent's heart. And God feels that feeling. God also feels incredible love. And even in the heart, every person's heart, God is loving that person and feels love for that person and hope for that person. So there's a mixture of desperation and hope because God knows that given the right circumstances, even the worst criminal can change, can become a good person. And so God is hoping for that miracle and working for that miracle. But we, on the outside of that criminal, can help because while God is working on the inside of the criminal, if that criminal meets someone like us who's joyful and laughing and cheerful and funny and able to penetrate the anger and the resentment and the hatred that make that criminal a criminal, if we can somehow break through that person's crust, it's sort of like, you know, God is digging from the inside out and we're digging from the outside in, and then the tunnel meets and light comes to that person. So we have that responsibility, I think, when we understand God's heart, to act on behalf of God with the same desperation and love that God has, so that when God's working on the inside of each person and we're working on the outside, finally we both break through, and then you know, like a tunnel, and then the light comes, and God's light and love can flow through that person, and they feel suddenly, oh, I feel God in me, and they thank us, but actually God was also inside all the time working. God's working all the time in everyone's heart. So if we understand that, our life changes. The way we live, we can live, our life can change. When we think about God as a God of a parent who's desperate and loving and true and infinitely kind and patient, but also totally impatient with sin, not wanting us to suffer one more second than we have to. You know, trying to alleviate suffering. Gandhi talked about alleviating suffering. You know, Mother Teresa talked about alleviating suffering. You know, she just wanted the last moments of their life on earth, whoever she was serving, to not be suffering, to be in the hands of someone who loved them. Right? That was her mission in India, was just alleviating suffering. So I think that that's what God is trying to do, and ultimately, I think if you study Father's teaching, if you can learn about who Father really was, not the rumors and not the, you know, the kind of stuff that goes around Father, but if you really study Father's teaching, you'll know that he was a pioneer who led the way to revealing the heart of God for 70 years of his life. And his teaching is still rippling outward through us, through every possible channel. So I think the world is coming to a time of great hope now. Thank you.
Just ordinary life I had experience. I was in the Stop and Shop. I was just trying to recycling the bottle, and then it was very busy. And I had two spots. One is somebody doing, and then I was here bringing in. And then two Spanish guy came in. One is very shoulder, and then one is very tall and very big shoulder and muscular. And then I was doing to recycle, but I felt, you know, this guy wearing that like work clothes and dipping the jeans or something, the big guy. And then I didn't know the Spanish language, but little guy telling him, the big guy, to help her. And then big guy helped me, you know, put in there and then process quickly. And then I look back to the thinking. My thinking is because of the clothes, and I felt I looked down on him. But actually, they are very simple, and then try to help me, you know. And then in the help, you know, in the heart, they are trying to help or helping or taking care of somebody, unselfishly. I felt God's presence, you know. And I thought, oh, I was just looking at externally to people, but always I have to look internally to people, how kind they and helpful. This we are the content good and bad, but behavior sometimes even good personality, but sometimes doing the bad behavior. But always walking through that, somebody try to help or hopeful to saying something good is I felt God's presence in the everybody, you know. But we are content both character. But if the sticking out to help, it's always I felt God, you know, with it as a person, and that is my teaching from God. You cannot look just externally. You have to see the internal part of the every person. Of the possibility to, if you bring to the good side, you can anybody can help, you know. That's why I try to do that. You know, everybody, any place we meet in somebody else, always to look up the good self, and then more happy to people can. Help somebody else or doing the unselfish act. And I felt and just even small the moment the God is walking to loving, helping, and this unselfish act. You know, that is I learned. You know.
Okay, so let's look for God in ourselves. Let's look for God in others. And let's try to break through that barrier that everyone has inside their heart. And let's try to build a world of God's kingdom together. Let's pray. Dear Father, hi. Thank you so much for today. Kind of different kind of sharing about your heart. So beautiful, your heart, Father. Thank you for loving us for thousands and thousands of years and for trying to reveal in us the good nature that we have within and to help us to live a true life. We know that you are desperate and loving and maybe afraid that what we'll do to ourselves, but also you're patient and you're persevering and you're impatient with sin and with our suffering. You don't want us to suffer even 1 second longer than we have to. Father, you are trying to liberate us. I pray that we can join you and our true parents and try to liberate this world from sin and sorrow and suffering. I pray that brothers and sisters out there who are watching this can take the time to study Father's teaching and to understand who Father was and what he came to teach and what he came to do. And they can benefit from that teaching and they can become themselves like you, Father, more desperate, loving, afraid for the sake of others, kind, persevering, and good, Father. I thank you so much and offer this day and this prayer in the name of Raman and Tamiko Montanaro, a blessed central family. 축복 중심 가정 라만과 타미코 모터널 이름으로 보고 드립니다. 아주 아멘.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.